You. Rich? My nephew's voice cracked mid-laugh, like he'd just heard the funniest joke of his life. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I love hearing from you all. The dining room echoed with it, spoons clinking, wine glasses rattling on the table from the vibrations of their amusement. My sister shook her head, smirking as if I were a child claiming I'd seen Santa. Even my son Daniel leaned back in his chair, grinning at me with that infuriating, patronizing tilt of the head. "Uncle George," he said, voice dripping with mockery, "you don't even own a decent car." I set my fork down gently, letting their noise roll over me like distant thunder. No anger, no protest, just the quiet kind of stillness that makes people uneasy, though they didn't notice yet. Across the room, the TV flickered on mute, its bright screen showing a headline in bold, "Forbes 100 Wealthiest People in America." My name was 3 scrolls down. That was the moment I knew it was over, because they were about to learn exactly who they had been laughing at. People think wealth is born in bright boardrooms, forged in sharp suits and polished shoes. Mine was built in the shadows, quiet mornings before sunrise, nights that bled into mornings again, and days where I was just a man with a calloused hand on a rusted wrench. I wasn't always George Whitmore, entrepreneur. I was just George, the boy from the narrow 2-bedroom house on Elm Street, with a mother who worked double shifts at the diner and a father who came home smelling of oil and metal from the shipyard. We had more debt than furniture, more quiet dinners than conversations, and yet, somehow I never felt poor. My parents carried their dignity like armor. When I turned 16, I left school early each day to work at a gas station. My friends thought I was foolish. Why pump gas when you could be at football practice or chasing girls? But every quarter I earned, I tucked into an old tobacco tin my father had given me. He used to say, "Money's not about what it buys, son. It's about the doors it can open when you knock at the right time." That tin bought me my first set of tools. Those tools opened the door to my first repair shop. It was a dingy space in a forgotten part of town, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were lost. I worked 16 hours a day, patching tires, tuning engines, changing oil. I had no employees, just a battered radio in the corner and my own stubbornness. But stubbornness has a way of turning into success if you feed it long enough. Within 5 years, I had 3 shops. 10 years later, I had 20. By the time I hit 50, I wasn't just fixing cars anymore. I was running a chain of service centers across 3 states and quietly investing my profits in logistics companies, small manufacturing plants, and eventually tech startups. The thing is, I never told my family much about it. I'd show up to birthdays in my old leather jacket and drive the same faded blue pickup I'd had since the 90s. I didn't care for flashy watches or new suits. Money to me was a tool, best kept sharp and unseen until needed. But here's what no one tells you about keeping your wealth quiet. People start to think you have nothing. My siblings, 2 brothers, 1 sister, had taken very different paths. My eldest brother, Thomas, climbed the corporate ladder in insurance. My younger brother, Martin, had a comfortable job in real estate. My sister, Claire, married well, at least in her eyes. All of them were convinced that my life was modest because I hadn't been as ambitious as they were, and I let them believe it. Maybe it was my fault. I never corrected their assumptions. When they talked about their summer homes and investment portfolios over Thanksgiving dinners, I'd just smile and pass the gravy. When they planned expensive family trips and didn't bother to invite me, assuming I couldn't afford it, I'd simply say I was busy with work. Over the years, their casual disregard became almost tradition. Little remarks would slip in. "George, you probably wouldn't like this restaurant. It's a bit pricey." Or, "We're thinking of renting a villa next summer and probably not your thing." They never meant it as cruelty, at least not in the beginning. But seeds of contempt grow fast when watered with arrogance. The shift came after my parents passed away. Suddenly, family gatherings became less about togetherness and more about competition. Who had the bigger house? Who drove the better car? Whose children were in the most prestigious schools? I still kept to myself. My joy was in my work and watching the businesses I'd built sustain hundreds of jobs and seeing my quiet investments grow. I didn't need their validation. But one person's opinion did matter to me, my son Daniel. Daniel had grown up watching me work. As a boy, he'd spend summers in the shop sweeping floors for pocket money. I had hoped he'd inherit not just the business, but the values that built it. Discipline, humility, respect. I paid for his education without telling him the full cost, made sure he had opportunities I'd never dreamed of, and always assumed he'd understand that wealth isn't about flaunting. It's about building. But somewhere along the way, I lost him to a different kind of thinking. When Daniel graduated and took his first corporate job, his circle changed. Suddenly, he was wearing designer suits, talking about networking dinners and exclusive clubs. He moved into a condo that cost more per month than my first shop's rent. And his tone toward me shifted. It wasn't outright disrespect at first, but there was an undercurrent of pity, as if he believed his old man was just scraping by, clinging to the life of a small-town mechanic. I brushed it off. Surely, I thought, one day he'd see the truth. That one day never came. Instead, the distance grew. He stopped asking me for advice. He started canceling our lunches last minute. He made jokes in front of others about my old truck and budget lifestyle. I told myself it was harmless, just his way of fitting in with his peers. Then came the night that would set everything into motion. It was Claire's birthday. She loved hosting grand dinners, the kind where the table groaned under the weight of dishes you could barely pronounce. The whole family was there, siblings, cousins, nieces, nephews. I sat near the end of the table, sipping quietly, listening to them boast about stocks, vacation homes, and business ventures. At some point, someone, I think it was Martin, turned to me and said with a smirk, "George, when are you going to join us in the big leagues?" The table chuckled. I felt Daniel's eyes on me, and when I glanced his way, he gave a small, amused shake of his head as if to say, "Don't embarrass yourself, Dad." That was the moment I realized something. This wasn't just ignorance anymore. This was mockery. They weren't laughing with me. They were laughing at me. And though I didn't know it yet, that dinner would be the last time they laughed so freely. Because I was done letting my silence be mistaken for weakness. Next came the small cracks, the early signs that their arrogance was about to cost them dearly. After that dinner, I began noticing details I had either ignored or excused for too long. It's funny. Once your eyes adjust to arrogance, you start seeing it everywhere. The first crack appeared at Thanksgiving that year. Claire had decided to keep things simple, which in her language meant a catered meal served on porcelain dishes with a floral arrangement taller than the turkey. I had brought along a bottle of red wine from a small vineyard I'd invested in years ago, a deep, complex vintage that had taken the gold medal at an international competition. I set it gently on the table, proud to share it. Claire glanced at the label for all of 2 seconds before saying, "Oh, we already opened a bottle from Bordeaux. Let's save this one for another time." Her tone wasn't unkind, but the way she set it aside, half hidden behind the breadbasket, made my jaw tighten. Later that evening, I overheard Daniel talking with Martin's son in the den. "Dad's always been practical," he said. "Not really into fine things. He's happy with what he's got." There was no malice in his voice, just that same faint pity. It stung worse than open insult. The second crack came when Martin invited everyone for a family investment dinner. I assumed it was a discussion about pooling funds for a new venture. But as soon as I arrived, I realized I was the only one without a glossy presentation folder in front of me. They had already prepared an investment plan for themselves, and my presence was more symbolic than participatory. Martin leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "George, I didn't include you in the numbers because I know this isn't really your sphere. But if you want to contribute something small, we can make space." I smiled politely, said nothing, and listened as they talked about returns, margins, and big plays. Not one of them knew that I had quietly funded 3 logistics startups whose combined value already dwarfed the figures they were tossing around. The third crack was Daniel himself. One Sunday afternoon, he called me out of the blue. His voice was warm, even affectionate, and for a moment I hoped, that maybe he just wanted to talk. But then came the real reason. "Dad, I'm putting together a down payment for a beach house," he said. "Just a getaway spot. I was wondering if you could loan me $50,000, just until my bonus comes in." I asked him gently why he needed a loan when he'd been boasting about his salary for months. He chuckled, a little awkwardly. "It's just easier this way," he said. "I mean, I know you can't do the whole amount, but anything would help." I could have told him right then that I could buy him the house outright. But something in his tone stopped me. Not gratitude, not respect, but an assumption that I couldn't possibly be in the position to help in any meaningful way. I gave him $5,000 and wished him luck. He thanked me distractedly and hung up before asking how I was. The fourth crack came quickly after. Claire invited me to a family planning meeting about our parents' old property on Elm Street. It had been sitting empty since they passed, and the taxes were eating into the estate. The plan was to sell it and split the proceeds. When I arrived, I found that Claire and Thomas had already accepted an offer from a developer without consulting me. "It's for the best, George," Claire said. "You wouldn't have been able to buy us out anyway." The way she said it, flat, matter-of-fact, wasn't just a dismissal. It was a verdict. In their minds, I was permanently on the outside, incapable of playing at their level. That night I sat in my living room, a single lamp casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. My house wasn't grand, but it was mine, paid for decades ago. The mantel above the fireplace held no awards, no proof of my so-called success, The evidence of my life's work sat in ledgers, contracts, and digital accounts that no one in my family had ever seen. I could have gone on like that forever, quiet, content, letting them believe what they wanted. But that dinner where they laughed in my face still echoed in my mind. And now these small cracks were adding pressure to something deep inside me. What I didn't realize yet was that these cracks weren't just signs of disrespect. They were warnings. The more they believed I had nothing, the bolder they would get in treating me as nothing. I wasn't angry, not in the way people imagine. It was colder than that, a slow, steady certainty that something had to change. And I knew even then that when the change came, it wouldn't be loud. It would be quiet, undeniable, and final. That certainty would solidify the night of the major betrayal, the moment that turned silent cracks into a full break. The breaking point came on a warm June evening at what was supposed to be a simple family celebration. Daniel had just turned 35, and Claire insisted on hosting a birthday dinner at a private club downtown. The kind of place where the staff remember your name, the lighting is low enough to hide the price tags, and the menu doesn't list prices at all. When I arrived, I noticed something right away. My seat was at the far end of the table, away from the cluster of voices and laughter near Daniel. I didn't mind the distance. I've never been one to fight for the spotlight. The meal started pleasantly enough. Wine flowed, plates clinked, and conversation drifted between vacation plans, stock performance, and new properties. I stayed quiet, content to listen. It was during dessert that Daniel cleared his throat and raised his glass. "I just want to thank everyone for being here," he began. "This year's been incredible for me. New projects, new investments, and well, I've got some big plans." There was applause, laughter. Claire leaned in and asked, "Are you finally going through with the resort deal?" Daniel nodded, eyes shining. "Yes, and I've invited some partners to join me. People who can really make this thing happen. High-level investors, people with vision." His gaze flicked briefly in my direction, then moved past me as if I were just another piece of furniture. Thomas grinned. "Guess that leaves George out, huh?" The table erupted in chuckles. Even Daniel smirked. "Well, yeah, Dad's not exactly in the investor circle. He's more old school." I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I kept my expression calm, my fork poised over a slice of cake I hadn't touched. "Old school?" I asked lightly. Daniel shrugged. "I mean, you've done fine for yourself, Dad, but this is a whole different level. It's nothing personal, it's just business." The words were polite on the surface, but the meaning underneath was sharp. I wasn't worthy, I didn't belong. That's when Martin, leaning back with his wine, decided to add his piece. "Honestly, George, you've never really been much of a player in the money game. We've all known that." I set down my fork, the silver making a soft clink against porcelain. "I see," I said quietly. Claire reached over, patting my hand as if consoling a child. "Don't take it the wrong way. You have your lifestyle and we have ours. It works." Something in me shifted then, not an explosion, but a slow, deliberate turning of gears. They had crossed from subtle dismissal into open humiliation, and they did it with the comfort of people who believed there would be no consequences. But the worst moment came after the plates were cleared. Daniel stood again. this time holding a sleek leather folder. "I wanted to share something with the family," he said, smiling like a man unveiling a great secret. Inside the folder were glossy renderings of the resort project. Sleek towers, private villas, pools shaped like crescents. "This is the future," he said, passing the images around. "We've already secured major investors. We just need to close the last round of funding." The folder reached me last. I turned the pages slowly, noting the names of companies and individuals involved. One name caught my eye. An international hospitality group I knew very well because I owned a controlling share in one of their largest suppliers. I closed the folder and handed it back. "Impressive," I said evenly. Daniel smiled faintly as if my approval was quaint but unnecessary. "Thanks, Dad. I appreciate you coming tonight. It means a lot." It was the kind of tone people use when speaking to someone they've decided is irrelevant. That was the moment. The exact second I knew there would be no coming back from this. Not because of the money, not because they excluded me from some investment deal, but because they had looked me in the eye and decided I was small. They had no idea how wrong they were. The ride home was quiet. My old pickup hummed along the freeway, headlights cutting through the summer darkness. I thought about the years I'd worked, the nights I'd come home smelling of oil and sweat, the risks I'd taken, the deals I'd made. All of it had been done quietly, without the need for applause. And yet, here I was, reduced in their eyes to a man they could laugh at in public. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had already begun forming the first threads of a plan. Not for revenge in the ugly, vengeful sense, but for a reckoning, a correction, a lesson. They had spent years underestimating me. I would show them exactly what that mistake cost. The very next morning, the first move came to me as naturally as breathing. I called my attorney, a sharp, discreet man named Harris, who had been with me since my second repair shop turned a profit. "I need you to pull everything," I told him. "Every holding, every investment, every piece of property. I want it clean and ready." He didn't ask why. Harris never asked why. From there, I made another call to the CEO of the hospitality group in Daniel's folder. We hadn't spoken in nearly a year, but he answered on the second ring. "George, I was just thinking about you," he said. "I bet you were," I replied. "Tell me about this resort deal you're working on." His tone shifted instantly. "Why?" "You're interested?" "I might be," I said. "But I'll need a meeting. Soon." We set it for the following Tuesday. Over the next few days, I began assembling pieces, pulling capital from one account, moving shares into another. Quiet adjustments, the kind you make when you know the board is already set and you just have to decide where to strike. I didn't tell anyone in the family what I was doing. I didn't drop hints or issue warnings. I let them believe the story they'd written about me, because the thing about underestimation is it works both ways. They thought I was irrelevant, but that meant they weren't watching me closely, and I intended to use that to full effect. The quiet planning phase had begun, and once it started, there was no turning back. The days after that dinner passed with deceptive calm. On the surface, nothing had changed. I still drove my faded blue pickup, still wore my old leather jacket, still kept my schedule of early mornings and quiet evenings. But underneath, I was moving pieces no one in my family even knew existed. Harris, my attorney, came by one afternoon with a stack of neatly organized binders. "Here's everything," he said, laying them on my dining table. "Full portfolio, liquid assets, property deeds, company shares. You're in a position to do just about anything you want, George." I flipped through the pages slowly, even though I knew the numbers by heart. The chain of auto service centers alone was worth more than my siblings' combined net worth. Add to that the logistics companies, the manufacturing plants, the tech startups, and the real estate holdings quietly appreciating in value for decades. "Keep it quiet," I said. "Not a word to anyone, especially not to my son." Harris nodded. "Discretion's what you pay me for." The meeting with the hospitality group's CEO was next. We met at a private office overlooking the harbor, the kind of place where the coffee comes in porcelain cups and the view itself feels like currency. "I hear Daniel's involved in your resort deal," I said after the small talk faded. The CEO smiled politely. "He's part of a group making a small contribution, mostly for networking, I think." "Why?" "I want in," I said simply. He leaned forward. "George, your shareholding in our supply company already makes you a valuable partner. Are you talking about joining as an investor or as a controlling interest?" I didn't blink. "Controlling." There was a pause, followed by a slow grin. "That would change the landscape quite a bit. You'd have the power to approve or reject any junior investors, including Daniel's group." "I know," I said. While Harris handled the paperwork, I moved to the next part of my plan, positioning the reveal. You see, revenge is sweeter when it's public, but it's strongest when it's undeniable. I didn't want a confrontation behind closed doors. I wanted a moment they couldn't twist, couldn't downplay, couldn't forget. That moment would come courtesy of Forbes. I'd been approached by them twice before for interviews about my companies. I'd declined both times. I had no interest in publicity, but now I saw the value. The next time their editor called, I said yes. Not only would I grant an interview, I'd give them exclusive access to my story. How a mechanic built a multi-million-dollar empire without ever leaving his small-town life. The photo shoot was arranged in my workshop, my hands still stained with grease, the pickup truck parked out front. The contrast was deliberate. "You sure you want to keep the truck in the shot?" the photographer asked. I smiled. "Absolutely." 2 weeks later, Harris called. "It's done. You now hold the majority stake in the resort project's parent company. If you want Daniel in, he's in. If you want him out..." I didn't answer right away. The satisfaction wasn't in shutting him out. It was in letting him realize that I held the choice. In the meantime, the whispers started. A few people in the local business community caught wind of the Forbes feature. Old acquaintances reached out, some with genuine warmth, others with opportunistic curiosity. I kept my responses polite, non-committal. One evening I got a call from Claire. "George, I heard something strange," she said cautiously. "Someone mentioned your name in connection with that resort deal. Are you involved?" "In a way," I said, and left it at that. There was a pause. "Well, I guess that's good for you." But her tone carried a faint unease, as if she'd just realized she might not know me as well as she thought. The final piece was timing. The Forbes issue would hit newsstands on a Thursday. The following Saturday, Daniel had invited the whole family for what he called a project milestone dinner. I didn't know if he planned to gloat, announce funding, or simply bask in attention. But I knew it would be the perfect stage. I arranged for the restaurant's private dining room to have a few copies of Forbes placed on a side table. Open to the page with my profile, my name printed in bold on their wealthiest Americans list. I wouldn't bring it up. I wouldn't need to. The night before the dinner, I sat at my kitchen table, the old tobacco tin my father had given me sitting in front of me. I opened it, running my fingers over the edges of the first dollar I'd ever saved. I thought about my father's words. Money's not about what it buys. It's about the doors it can open when you knock at the right time. Tomorrow I wouldn't just knock. I'd open the door wide enough for them to see exactly what they'd been ignoring all these years. And then I'd decide, calmly, deliberately, who was allowed to walk through it. By Saturday night, the trap would be set and the lesson would be impossible to miss. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of quiet clarity I hadn't felt in years. I wore the same dark blazer I'd worn to Daniel's college graduation, a crisp white shirt, and the watch my father had left me. A modest piece, the kind you wear for sentiment, not display. I drove my old blue pickup, letting its familiar rattle follow me down the polished streets toward the restaurant. The private dining room was already buzzing when I walked in. Laughter, clinking glasses, the faint hum of background music. Daniel stood at the head of the table, shaking hands with Martin, grinning at Claire, giving a quick nod to Thomas. I saw the same seating arrangement as before, me tucked at the far end. Perfect. I took my seat quietly, offering polite greetings. On the side table by the wall, just as arranged, lay 3 open copies of Forbes, the glossy pages catching the warm light. My photo, me in the workshop, grease on my hands, the pickup in the background, spread across 2 pages. Above it, the headline, George Whitmore, the quiet titan of American industry. And there on the right margin, my name on the Forbes 100 wealthiest Americans list. I could feel their eyes slide past me without recognition. Not yet. Dinner began with the usual flow of conversation. Vacations, investments, minor gossip. Daniel was practically glowing. When dessert plates were cleared, he tapped his glass. "First of all, thank you all for coming," he began. "Tonight's special. The resort project is moving forward, and I'm proud to say we've secured nearly all our funding. We're on track to break ground next spring." Applause. Claire leaned toward Thomas, whispering something with a smile. Daniel continued. "I've been lucky to bring in some incredible partners, people with vision, resources, and influence. This project will put our name on the map in ways we can't even imagine." I let him finish his speech, watching the room soak in his self-assuredness. Then Harris, my attorney, whom I had invited as a friend, stood and cleared his throat. "If I may," he said, glancing toward Daniel, "there's one more thing you should all know about the resort project." The room quieted. Daniel looked puzzled but motioned for him to continue. Harris turned slightly, gesturing toward me. "The majority stake in the project's parent company belongs to George." The silence was instant and sharp, like air sucked out of the room. Claire blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Harris smiled faintly. "George purchased controlling interest last month, which means any investor's participation, including yours, Daniel, is subject to his approval." Daniel's face froze. "That's No, that can't be. It's public record, Harris said mildly, and it's all legal. He could, if he wished, remove your group entirely. I kept my voice calm. Relax, Daniel. I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here to correct a misunderstanding. Claire's gaze darted to the Forbes magazines. She stood, crossed the room, and picked one up. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the page, her eyes catching the photo, then the list. Number 63, she whispered. That's you? I nodded once. Always has been. The magazines began to circulate, whispers spreading like ripples on water. The room's energy shifted, not toward celebration, but toward a dawning realization that the man they dismissed for decades had been operating on a level they couldn't have imagined. Thomas was the first to speak. Why didn't you ever say anything? Because it was never your business, I said evenly. And because I didn't need your approval to measure my life's worth. Daniel was still standing, his mouth working but no words coming out. Finally he managed, "You could have told me." I met his gaze, steady and unflinching. I could have. But you never asked, not really. You assumed. And when people assume small things about you long enough, sometimes it's better to let them find out in their own time. Harris excused himself soon after, his work here done. I stayed sipping my coffee while they fumbled through awkward questions. Claire tried for a laugh. Well, I suppose we've all underestimated you, George. I gave her the faintest smile. Yes, you have. Then I turned to Daniel. As for your resort deal, if you want it to go forward with your group, it will. But I have one condition. He straightened, wary. What? That from this day forward you speak to me as an equal. No more jokes at my expense, no more public dismissals. You may not respect what I choose to drive or wear, but you will respect me. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he nodded once. All right. His voice was quiet, stripped of its earlier confidence. I left before the others, stepping out into the cool night air. The city lights stretched before me, glittering like the numbers in my ledgers. Beautiful, yes, but meaningless without the right perspective. As I walked to my truck, I heard hurried footsteps behind me. It was Daniel. Dad, he said, his voice low, I'm sorry. I looked at him, searching for sincerity. There was some there, maybe enough to work with. We'll see, I said, then got into my truck. Over the next week, the ripple effects were exactly what I expected. Claire called twice, inviting me to lunch. Martin sent an email asking for business advice. Thomas left a voicemail congratulating me on finally getting the recognition you deserve. I answered none of them, not yet. Daniel, however, showed up at my workshop on Wednesday afternoon. He stood in the doorway watching me tighten a bolt on a carburetor. You still work on these yourself? He asked. I nodded. Keeps me grounded. He stepped inside, hands in his pockets. I didn't realize any of it. That's because you didn't want to, I said, not unkindly. He hesitated, then said, I'd like to learn. Not just about the money, about how you did it, how you lived. It wasn't a full apology, but it was a start. The resort deal went forward with Daniel's group included on my terms. Contracts were signed, funding secured. And in every meeting from that point on, Daniel introduced me as our lead partner. The family dinners changed too. No more jokes about my truck or my budget lifestyle. Instead, there was a carefulness in their words, a subtle recognition that whatever they thought they knew about me was incomplete. I didn't flaunt it. I didn't need to. The point had been made. Some people think revenge is about burning bridges. For me, it was about building one high enough that they had to climb to meet me, while never forgetting who built it in the first place. And as I looked at the signed contracts, the Forbes issue framed on my workshop wall, and the quiet way Daniel now asked for my opinion before making a move, I knew the lesson had landed. But even lessons have echoes, and for some the real downfall was still to come. The lesson might have been delivered, but the echo of it, the real sting, didn't arrive all at once. For Daniel, it came slowly, like a curtain lifting on a stage he thought he owned, only to find himself standing in someone else's spotlight. At first he tried to pretend nothing had changed. He still hosted meetings, still spoke confidently about his resort project. But in the boardroom there was a subtle shift. People deferred to me. My questions carried more weight than his presentations. The hospitality group's executives called me first. He noticed. I could see it in the way he lingered after meetings, his jaw tight, his pen clicking rapidly between his fingers. Pride is a fragile thing. It doesn't shatter with one blow. It fractures quietly, under the pressure of being overshadowed. For Claire and Martin, the downfall was social. Our town has its own kind of hierarchy, and news spreads fast in those circles. The Forbes feature wasn't just read, it was discussed. At the club, at charity galas, at luncheons. People who once turned to Claire for advice on high-level investing began sidestepping her to ask about my business strategies. Martin's so-called big league investor friends suddenly remembered my number. And when they called me directly, I didn't send them back through him. They hated it. Not because I had money, but because they could no longer pretend I was beneath them. The most public unraveling, though, came 3 months later. Daniel had organized a lavish investor dinner to celebrate the resort breaking ground. I attended as controlling partner, but stayed quiet while he gave a polished speech. Then, during the Q&A, one of the lead architects, an outspoken woman named Marisol, pointed at me. "I just want to thank Mr. Whitmore," she said into the mic. "Without his strategic funding and his early commitment to the supply contracts, this project wouldn't even exist." There was polite applause, but I saw the way Daniel's smile faltered. That night, for the first time, he didn't linger to shake my hand after the event. For me, the revenge wasn't in watching them stumble, it was in watching them adapt. Pride makes people reckless. Humility forces them to change. Daniel began showing up at my workshop every other week. He didn't just watch this time. He swept the floors, changed oil, asked about margins and vendor relationships. I made him start at the bottom just like I had. One afternoon while we were closing up, he said quietly, "I think I've spent most of my life chasing the wrong kind of respect." I didn't answer right away. Some truths don't need to be met with words, they need to be met with silence. So they settled deeper. Claire's change was subtler. She stopped hosting the extravagant dinners. The next Thanksgiving, she showed up at my house instead, carrying 2 homemade pies and wearing an apron. No speeches, no dismissive glances at my wine, just presence. Martin took longer. His pride was bone deep. But when one of his deals collapsed and he called for advice, not money, just advice, I gave it freely. Not to rub his nose in it, but because my father had taught me that power isn't in what you withhold, but in what you choose to give. The real downfall, I realized, wasn't them losing status. It was them having to live with the memory of how they'd treated me. You can't erase that kind of shame. It lingers, reshaping how you speak, how you look someone in the eye. And for me, I didn't need to say "I told you so." They'd tell it to themselves every time they saw my name in print, every time they walked past the Forbes issue framed on my workshop wall, every time Daniel introduced me as my father, our lead partner. Revenge in the end didn't taste like fire. It tasted like quiet tea on a Sunday morning, knowing that dignity once restored never needs to be announced again. But there was one final step before I could close this chapter entirely, deciding how I wanted to leave it in the family's memory. The final step came quietly, without ceremony. I didn't want a grand gesture or a parting shot. I wanted something that would settle into their memories like a slow-burning ember, something they'd carry without even realizing it. That winter, I invited the entire family to my house for a simple Sunday lunch. No catering, no polished silverware, just roast chicken, fresh bread, and the apple pie recipe my mother had passed down. They arrived cautiously, unsure if this was another setup for a revelation. But the table was warm. The food was simple, and I asked for nothing more than their company. Halfway through the meal, Daniel looked around the modest kitchen and said, "You could live anywhere, Dad." "Why here?" I smiled. "Because I like it here. And because I've never measured my life by how far I could move, but by how well I could stay." Claire set down her fork. "I think we all misunderstood you." "No," I said gently. "You understood exactly what you wanted to see. I just let you." There was no bitterness in my voice, only truth. And truth, when spoken plainly, has a way of leaving a room silent. After dessert, I gave each of them an envelope. Inside was a single photograph, me standing in the doorway of my first repair shop, 27 years old, grease on my face, and a small sign overhead reading, "Open for business." On the back, I'd written one line, "Every door I've opened started here." No lecture, no conditions, just a reminder. When they left, Daniel stayed behind to help clear the table. As he dried the last dish, he said quietly, "I used to think success meant proving you were better than someone else. Now I think it's about proving you can be better than you used to be." I put a hand on his shoulder. That's closer to the truth than most people ever get. In the weeks that followed, the family dynamic shifted, not in some fairy tale way where every wrong was forgotten, but in a way that felt balanced. The dismissive comments stopped. Invitations came without hesitation. And when my name came up in conversation, it was with a respect that had been absent for years. I didn't flaunt my wealth. I never needed to. The point was never about money, it was about dignity, about reminding them and maybe myself that silence doesn't mean absence, and humility doesn't mean weakness. One morning, months later, I found Daniel in the workshop, coffee in hand, already sweeping the floor before I arrived. He looked up and grinned. "Figured I'd get a head start." I nodded, hiding the quiet satisfaction that rose in me. He didn't see it, but in that moment I knew the lesson had rooted itself deep enough to last. The framed Forbes issue still hangs on my wall, not for visitors, but for me. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the day I chose not to shout my worth, but to let it speak for itself. And if years from now they forget the details of the dinner, the magazines, the resort deal, they'll still remember the feeling. That moment when the person they thought they knew stood in front of them and proved without raising his voice that they had been wrong all along. Because in the end, true revenge isn't about making them see your power, it's about making them see you.